Good afternoon, everyone. Can I please ask you to take your seats so we can get started? And I'd encourage you, because we have 4 parallel sessions going simultaneously, I'm sure the room won't be very full. So if you want to move forward, here's your chance to get front row seats. No need to sit in the back unless you want to disappear quietly. But do move forward so we can fill in the first third of the auditorium or something. No, don't be shy. I'm Franz Fries Gross. I'm Director of Transport at the World Bank. And I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's session on gender in the age of new mobility. Just a few housekeeping announcements. So some of the speakers will be speaking in French, so we have simultaneous translation. If you don't have one of these headphones, please go to the door where I think we have a few extra ones in case you need them. And then I just want to remind everyone that after this series of 4 parallel sessions, we do have a closing plenary. And that'll be at 3:15 this afternoon. So I'd invite everybody back for that so we can close with a bang. So without further ado, let me just call to the stage the panelists for this session. The first is Souad Abderrahim, the mayor of Tunis. Please join me. I think we have a seat right there. Then José Segundo López Valderrama of WRI. Jose is here, very good. Isabel Granada of Inter-American Development Bank. Lisette Soria Sotelo, UN Women. I'll introduce them all properly in just a moment, but at some point we're just taking our seats. Then we have Paula Tapia, former Minister of Transport of Chile. Paula, welcome, excellent. Amar Amalek of Harvard Kennedy School. Excellent. Alexa Roscoe. And Inka Schomer of the World Bank. So thank you very much. I think we're all here. So welcome to our first this parallel session on gender in the age of new mobility. Those of you who were at Transforming Transportation last year, you'll recall we had a panel on gender and transport. And one of the big takeaways, which I think was something of a departure from previous treatments of gender before, is that transport is very fundamentally gender unequal. So it isn't gender neutral at all, and it needs to be looked at sort of through a gender lens very carefully. So what we'd like to do this year is to build on that finding that transport isn't gender neutral, and have an opportunity to organize a discussion today around mobility barriers that women face across the world, as well as potential solutions to address them. We have with us today a very distinguished groups of panelists that represent government, the international community, aid agencies, academia. And our panel of experts will be divided into 2 groups. So on one side, we'll have those that explain the barriers to different topics, technical barriers, legal barriers, those affecting personal security and employment. And on the other, what are some of the innovative solutions we have to address that? So our objective, if we can get this right, is to send you home after this session, or after the final session, with some really concrete ideas about how to identify these barriers and deal with them, that you can, something hopefully that you'll be able to take back into your day-to-day jobs. So let me just begin by introducing our panelists before we go to the actual questions. So the first here to my right is José Segundo López. He's a civil engineer with a master's in transportation from Columbia. He has worked in research and consultancy in mobility and road safety for the last 3 years and works for WRI in Bogota. José Segundo, welcome. To José's right, we have Isabel Granada, a senior transport specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. She's a civil engineer with a master's in transport and management from Imperial College in London. And since 2015, she's been coordinating the ITS and gender initiatives of the transport division at IDB. Isabel, welcome. To Isabel's right, we have Lisette Soria Sotelo. Welcome, Lisette. She works at UN Women. She's got over 10 years of research policy and program management experience in the area of ending violence against women in urban development. Throughout her career, she's been very actively involved in using research findings to inform policy, programs, and project implementation. Next to Lisette, we have Paola Tapia, the former Minister of Transport of Chile and a founding member of Iniciativa Mujeres en Movimiento and the Red Ciudad Futura. Paola studied the Faculty of Law at the Universidad Católica de Chile, and she graduated as a lawyer. I know she has a master's degree from the Universidad Católica de Valparaíso and a diploma in public management and public policy from the Universidad de Chile. Paola, welcome to our panel. To Paola's right then, we have Amer Malik, an Associate Director of Research at the Harvard Kennedy School. He leads research policy engagements that drive actionable policy insights from rigorous research. We'd expect nothing less from Harvard, so we'll be looking forward to his insights. Next to Amer, we have Alexa Roscoe. She is the digital economy lead at our sister organization in the World Bank, at the IFC Gender Secretariat, where she works with the private sector to find ways where disruptive technologies can open new economic opportunities for women. Again, to her right, we have Inka Schomer, an operations officer leading the SMAP Gender and Social Inclusion Program at the World Bank. In addition to her work at SMAP, she's also the task team leader of the Africa Gender and Energy Program. Inka, welcome. And last but very, very definitely not least, we have Suad Abderrahim. She was elected mayor of Tunis in July of 2018, so only 6 months ago. And she is the first woman to serve as Tunis's mayor, as she told me, in the last 160 years. And the first one ever elected. And I'm proud to say I think she is the only elected female mayor anywhere in the Arab world, certainly of any major city. So we're honored to have you, Mayor Abderrahim. Welcome to the World Bank. So let me invite all of you, let's welcome the entire panel with a big round of applause before we get started. So we'll, as I said, we'll look at 4 different aspects of gender equality and look at a problem statement and a corresponding solution. So the first 2 couplets representing problems and solutions are to my immediate right, and we'll always, I don't want to label people as the problem people and the solution people. Everybody here is a solution person, but we have sort of taken the liberty of asking one of them to frame a problem and the other to frame more of a solution. So let me start with Jose Segundo. You know, we know, Jose, that data collection and analysis is absolutely fundamental for transport planning. We also know that gender statistics are crucial not only for awareness raising and advocacy, but also for evidence-based planning. Now, in the transport sector, we haven't really thought of gender that hard, I think, historically. And for a long time, we've relied on instruments such as origin destination studies that haven't really taken account of differences in gender. So can you, just in your experience, tell us something about the challenges of incorporating gender considerations into transport planning?
Yes. Well, I'm going to talk about then the issues we found in a study we did in Bogota together with Despacio, here with Marina Moscoso, Valentina Montoya, and myself. And we found several challenges on the data analysis we did. We focused on gender, basically because traditional mobility surveys, they do not, first of all, they do not take in, they do not collect crucial data for gender analysis. So a lot of information that could be collected isn't being collected. They also do not sometimes do not present a sufficient sample, like so it could be used for detailed analysis in gender analysis. And they also do not present data about why trips were not made. They only present that, the trips that were made, but not the ones that people wanted to make. So these are 3 main issues that we consider to be important to address in future and new mobility solutions that could help us with. In the part of the information that is not collected, we found that there is not sufficient detail, for example, or even it's not collected, for example, for the first and the last mile connectivity in public transport, which is, I think, key for analyzing accessibility of women and why they choose for one mode or another. Another thing we considered that the sample is not big enough, so the women are very diverse. So if you cannot do detailed analysis in order to analyze the mobility patterns of women, then you won't be able to focus on the actual necessities of women. And the third one is that they do not collect the trips that were not made, obviously. But it is very important, specifically for a gender approach, to understand why they were not made. So the quantitative data that we have today tells us what is happening, but not why. So we need to complement this data with other ways of collecting it and analyzing the data. I also believe it's an issue for road safety, like not having the detailed information, because so far we focused on just where victims were reported, but we cannot tell if a woman stopped doing her trip because of lack of accessibility, because of higher perception of risk in road safety, and any other risk like personal safety as well. So this new wave of new technologies and new mobility, I think, will allow us to have massive amounts of data that could fill this gap, and could also lead us to better and more focused action specifically for women.
Thanks for that, Jose. So, Isabel, you've heard quite a number of data gaps from Jose. I mean, in terms of talking to the wrong people, never learning about the trips that were never made because you're not asking women about why they didn't take public transport. And I know at Inter-American Development Bank, you've been doing some very innovative work to try to find solutions around that. So perhaps you could share it with us.
First of all, thank you for being here. I mean, for this great audience. It's the first time I see so many, in a panel on gender. So yeah, Segundo has pointed out significant barriers that women face, in mobility. And at the IDB, what we have tried to do is to mainstream innovation in the transportation sector, and this includes the subsector of gender and transport. Basically, what we have done so far is to tackle the problem of sex disaggregated data. Technology, it's of course, one of the main tools to do it. And in the last couple of years, I don't know if you've heard, but cell phone companies have become really, useful to understand mobility patterns. They actually know where we are, where we go, the speed at what we travel. So they have provided an additional solutions to the OG matrices that we normally build. This is called the CDRs, the Call Detail Records. It's basically like a capsule of information that knows a lot about the user, starting by which gender you are. So this has been a great advantage. Currently, we're trying to capture this kind of data in different countries of Latin America, and this helps us to, probably ratify that more than 50% of users of the public transport systems in Latin America are women. So I think that's an important thing. But then you come to the question on how do you understand the needs of women? And probably what I would like to share with you is that at the IDB, we have developed our own code to understand that. This is not new. I'm not saying we are, the most innovative, but I'm sure you all know about Waze. The power of crowdsourcing has to be really used. And in this case, what we have come is to have this app that will ask you what are the attributes of your trip that you value the most. We did a test, and it was very funny, even though it's not representative of the whole population. We ran a test in the metro in Washington, D.C., and what we found is that women, in this context in particular, we don't like to travel alone. The kind of information that was provided by users is like, the train is empty, rather than saying the train is really crowded. And what we have seen is this is a very powerful tool, because I'm sure many of you have been in the situation in which you are in a train platform and you see the sign saying the train is coming, but you don't know how crowded or how empty is this train. So I would say that's another innovative approach. And probably in the third level, what we, after 4 years of working on gender and transport and really trying to innovate in this sector, what we think it's the discussion on gender has to become more about inclusion and talking about accessibility. So right now, what we're trying to do is to build a platform that captures, it's like a journey map. What we want to know, it's like the disutility or the pain that every user faces when you leave home until you get to work. One thing is that the metro system or the BRT or the cable can provide you the best solutions, ramps and all the signs, everything, but you don't know, the first and the last mile. So maybe those are the 3 types of solutions we're doing so far. And lastly, and I know I'm running out of time, technology is not the only way to innovate. Sometimes this is a matter of having a different approach. And I would like to really invite you to check on our webpage, the Transport Gender Lab. We have built a knowledge repository of experiences or of projects that have been executed in Latin America and the Caribbean. Having the cities sharing their knowledge, their experience, their failures on this topic, it's been key to be more innovative and really know how we can address these gaps.
Thanks, Isabel. So let me turn it back to Jose, and just for a follow-up question. So you mentioned how historically a lot of the transport data we collect for planning purposes isn't really gender informed. We don't dig for those gender aspects. Can you talk to us a little bit about what happens when you don't get that gender disaggregation? So what are some of the, I guess, some of the missteps that ensue from that?
Okay, I will talk then about 3 examples. The first one is going to be about cycling in Bogota. The second one is going to be about a subgroup of women, domestic workers in Bogota, who have a very special mobility pattern that needs to be analyzed. And the other one would be like promoting walking and cycling, maybe to public transport or as a whole trip, specifically for women, and how not having the data is an issue today. So the first one, in Bogota, between the years of 2011 and 2015, the amount of trips by bicycle increased significantly. The issue is that they increased mainly for men, not for women. And this probably was because the lack of data does not allow you to go and see exactly why this is happening. And there is, for instance, an area in the south part of Bogota, which is also the poorest part of Bogota, that almost 0 trips by women are made by bicycle, and they're only doing 20% of the trips today in the whole city. So having detailed data about, first of all, why they're not making the trips in a disaggregated level, also with the effort that you collect the quantitative data, collect this type of qualitative data, would be crucial in order to understand how to further promote the bicycle among women as well. The other example then is domestic workers. They are a group of women that have significantly higher travel times than the rest of the women. And this is probably due to the fact that they have very low accessibility to public transport as they live in poor areas. And they also have as a destiny a rich area which also has a low accessibility for public transport. It would be crucial to then analyze the first and last mile connectivity, have detailed data in order to be able to analyze this issue to further improve their conditions. Also in this issue, cross-sectional mobility surveys, they do not allow to fully understand and to go deep in the analysis per area or what's happening to go and further analyze the actions that we could make to improve accessibility for this group. The third example is promoting then this type of access could be difficult since we don't have the data, for example, of the path chosen by women and how it is different or why they don't make the trips. So I think promoting walking to, for example, the public transport is difficult because, excuse me, we don't have the specific data to act on it, and it's very necessary. And I think in the new mobility area, we have a unique opportunity for collecting massive data with a detail that we need for acting in these topics.
Thanks, Jose. I think it's interesting to sort of think about why is it that you have zero bicycling by women in southern Bogota and only 20% citywide, and what are the things you'd have to tweak on those bike paths to get more women using bicycles. Isabel, you had so many good examples, and they all seem like no-brainers. Why isn't everybody doing this? What are some of the barriers that keep people from getting gender disaggregated data, better planning purposes? Where are the barriers and what's the resistance?
Probably the best word to summarize the barriers is the narrative. I would say that 4 years ago, the narrative on gender was really boring for public officials. Coming to a male major, and say, you know, it's very important that you modify the way you do the processes. It's important. That was, you know, followed by a weird look of, why do I need to do this? So changing the narrative to understanding that if women represent that more than 50% of the users in the public transport systems, this translates into revenue. You know, this is the main source of demand. So why don't you understand what they need? And this will, you know, be redundant of increasing your own revenue. So that has been one of the main challenges, and the way to tackle it is to be, I think, be bold. You know, we need to change the way we present this to our own sector. The second barrier, I would say it's only the priority of the resources. When you talk about this, it's always there is something that is more important, you know, building infrastructure. But the important thing is to present this as these are things that need to be connected. And of course, there are some concerns on the new technologies and way to gather data. I have found public officials presenting concerns on data breaches. You know, when you have, or when you use CDRs, like the cell phone data, the main concern is how can you make sure that every single amount of data, it's anonymous. So I would say that has been another barrier for implementation. And I would say that's being right now addressed. Initiatives as having, you know, regional dialogues on this kind of issues, it's very important.
Excellent. So overcoming indifference and overcoming worries about data security are big impediments.
Yes, correct.
Excellent. So let's switch gears. So we've talked about technical barriers. So gender disaggregated data never making its way into good planning. Let's move to the legal sphere. And we have Lisette and Paula to talk about that. So let me turn first to Lisette and say, tell us a little bit from your perspective, Lisette, what are the legal barriers that limit women's access to mobility? And if we focus down a little tighter, what are some of the legal barriers that many countries face to dealing with the issue of sexual harassment in public transport?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the World Bank for inviting us to this panel, which is quite important. To answer to your question, it's important to first situate the overview of the legislation against sexual harassment at the world. So we know that sexual harassment is completely normalized in every country, in developed and developing countries. And unfortunately, when we look at the situation nowadays, for example, out of the 189 countries that ratified the Convention on the Elimination Against Discrimination Against Women, only we have 35 countries that do not have any legislation against sexual harassment at all. And when we look closer at legislation against sexual harassment in public spaces, which includes public transport, the situation is worse. We have 157 countries that does not have legislation on how to prevent and respond to sexual harassment in public spaces. So why? What are the barriers? Why we have so few countries that prohibit sexual harassment, leaving so many women, who are the most users of public transport, susceptible to this form of discrimination and violence? So first of all, definitely you address it, is the lack of data also on the prevalence and incidence of sexual harassment. So it's harder for us to make a case to have legislation on this issue. But it's not only just the data, it's also a lack of understanding and even a lack of definition of what sexual harassment is. So when there is no understanding of this phenomenon, of this issue, it's harder to create a legal framework around it, right? A third one, which is one of the most difficult ones, you can create data, you can provide information on the definition, but the institutional and social norms that go around sexual harassment are the most difficult to change. And I want to be specific when I talk about which social norms and attitudes. It's, for example, men entitlement to women's bodies. For example, when you're waiting for a bus, right? The men entitlement to say something about how you're dressed or to touch or even worse forms of violence. So there is these social norms around women's bodies in public spaces that are harder to tackle, right? Another one that is another barrier that limits more of these legal frameworks is weak leadership, or at least leadership that don't speak up against sexual harassment. We have seen with the Me Too movement the potential and the positive effect that you can have when you have a strong leadership at the government and private sector to speak against sexual harassment in public spaces. Finally, one which is also one of the main constraints and challenges is that lawmakers in every country in the world are mostly men, and they are mostly privileged men who likely don't have to suffer sexual harassment when they go and take a bus or when they have to work to take the kids to schools. So usually it's not in the agenda sometimes, this issue, because it's not a priority or because it hasn't really been part of it, right? So one of the challenges is that we have few women in these leadership positions. Just to give you some numbers, in 1997, only 12% of legislators around the world were women, and 10 years after, we have only 23% of women legislators around the world. So we have a long way to go, but luckily we have strong women that will give us concrete examples what they can do when they are in positions of power. And finally, I would just address one of the key challenges also to put forward more these legislative frameworks is when cities or countries have a weak civil society organization. So given that sexual harassment is not an issue sometimes as a priority, it is women's rights organizations who push forward this issue to the agenda. But in those cities or those countries that is fragmented, this civil society or this women's rights organization is less likely that women will put forward this issue, or men, committed men, to reduce it in public spaces. So those are the key challenges.
Thank you. That's a great overview, Lisette. Let me ask Paula, as a former Minister of Transport in Chile, and you recognize the importance of a strong legal framework during your tenure, and the changes that would be needed to enhance women's mobility. Let me ask you, what's your experience? How can these legal barriers be overcome?
Mm-hmm. Well, good afternoon. I want to thank World Bank for this invitation, especially Carla Gonzalez. I improved my English, but today is a good opportunity to practice with you. I understand. I was Minister of Transportation and Telecommunication in my country, in Chile. I was the first woman in this area, maybe 50 years. And for this reason, it's very important for me and for my team, the different action and measures about the gender equality, especially in mobility. I worked in different areas for 15 years in this ministry, air transport, maritime area, public transport, and others. In all these areas, the majority of those who work were men, especially in companies, especially in the private sector in general. For being the first female minister and for observing for years the difference between men and women. We work especially concrete actions for incorporate women in the work of transport. We approach the challenge from two lines in concrete actions. First, how do we incorporate more women in the transport labor work? And second, how do we incorporate the vision of women as users of the different public transport services? In both of two cases, the existence of a legal and policy framework that government and civil society, especially civil society, we can leverage were key. To incorporate more women in the world of work, some data. In Chile, for example, in Chile, the National Congress, the representation of women now is about 3%. It's so-so. But in companies, in general, in the role of the director is only 6%. Well, in this context, we prepared the first national transportation policy and gender equity. This was the legal and policy framework that we used to develop the actions. Within the framework of gender equity policy and continued the work done, we increased the number of drivers in public transport from scholarships granted by the government to obtain free training, giving facilities for women to attend. So, in 4 years, we tripled the number of drivers in public transport. We also created incentive such as the Women in Road Award 2, highlight public and private companies that have incorporated relative initiative in gender issues. For example, by 2017, we had 43% participation of women in the directive in the public transport company, metro and railway. The government completed its goal. The second line is about for the service for the users. I was able to put for the processing of the bill that regulates sexual harassment, which has been in the National Congress for almost 3 years. The previous show that to advance the law can be very relevant, but have other times in many occasions. We hope that this law promoted by civil society, which is very valuable through the Street Observatory, can be promptly approved and applied. In the meantime, two local governments of very different political positions have passed a law punish street harassment, including public transport. The new law pertaining to sexual harassment is near completion.
Excellent, thank you, Paula. Let me turn it back to Lisette. So you mentioned how few countries actually have legislation on the books banning sexual harassment. Can you talk a little bit about those that do have legislation that prevent it? What's the step? How difficult is it to implement once you've actually passed it? Because one thing, of course, is passing it, convincing all those privileged older men in the Congress to pass it. But once you have it passed, can you talk about some of the implementation barriers?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is really important because that's the main weakness, the implementation from the legislation. So one of the key issues is the lack of realistic policy frameworks and action plans that come with that legal framework. So it doesn't come with a concrete action plan defined by time, period, and most importantly, budget. A lot of this legislation comes without budget. So of course you cannot implement all these great initiatives that you have to prevent and respond to sexual harassment in public spaces. Another key impediment is the lack of capacity in preventing and responding to sexual harassment in public spaces, both in the government and also in the private sector. There is a lack of gender expertise in this sector on how to deal with these issues and the sensitivity on how to do this. And unfortunately, in certain cases, what happens is that they assign like the woman who is the architect or the woman who is an engineer to deal with the issue without the gender expertise. So that makes it difficult to implement. Also, one of the key challenges for implementation is that all these reporting schemes are very inaccessible, are bureaucratic. From what we have learned from the cities where we work at, those few women who are brave enough to come and to report what sexual harassment, where it happened, usually there is a lot of victim blaming. Oh, how were you dressed? Why were you walking alone? Because you cannot walk alone. At what time of the day were you walking? So all this also victim blaming makes it difficult to implement all these initiatives, especially at the response side. There is also lack of collaboration and partnership between different institutions, and that makes it difficult also for the response side, because we need access to a coordination from different services, a range of services. I would say also one of the key challenges for implementation is that because it's been so recent, all this work on legislation and policy frameworks, we don't have enough evidence of what is working and what is not. So even if that country or that city has the best will to do it, they want to know the how. They are like, okay, tell me what really works, what doesn't. But because it's recently new, most of these legislation are starting to come up only since 2000. And more in practice 2010. So it's kind of recent and we don't have enough evidence. So we need also more of these funds to do more evidence and to know exactly what works and what doesn't work, so that cities and those committed institutions can better implement.
Thanks, Lisette. And Paula, I know you were in the trenches pushing for this law. You said it's been stuck in Congress for 3 years. And I heard like an ojalá at the end. Hopefully now it'll come and it'll be approved, but it's not quite out, right? So I guess my question to you is, since you didn't have this law to work with, does that mean that you and civil society had your hands tied when you were in office, or were the things that you could do to fight sexual harassment in public spaces even without the law to support you?
Well, we hope we have the new law very easy, but the time of the Congress is different. But well, the action started without even the existence of a law. It's an important for us concrete actions. We start this journey through the internal awareness to the different teams of the minister and create a special program, for example, of sexual harassment with especially professional, and it's very important in a little group. No big group, because the women is very important to speak about in the little. From this, a training plan was designed for drivers to want to importance of the subject. Other point is about for example, infrastructure. I need the new infrastructure for the women, but we provide internal infrastructure into the minister. For example, nursing room. If we will require companies to come on it, we have to leave up the minister. The first is the minister. We work safety other plans. For example, implemented 37 night buses service. It's very important for the security in the displacement to women and men, and girls and boys, all. Together with the above, we develop a public building process for the new transport system in which a compulsory percent of women's fees of 3% was established and gradually increased. Additionally, it's very important, we carry out service which the perceptions of the safety of women and men in public transport was measures when a woman is driving, and a woman widely at the wheel gives more confidence. Additionally, implementing other projects is very important, develop an implementation in this area. I think about the gender and mobility is very, very important, consolidate the leadership in mobility. For this reason, with the 7 spectacular women, we create Women in Motion. Women in Motion is a new group when the mission, special mission, is to deliver to more women and men technical and the political, strategic and leadership tools to move from study to actions. We invite you to meet and be part of Women in Motion. I think it is possible to transform for the name of the meeting, it is possibly advanced if it is done by combining actors. It's very important, the civil society, broadening of our eyes, developing public policies with conviction and commitment in favor of people. I congratulate to Segundo and Marina, WI and Despacio for this work because it's very interesting. I need more study for this and the study to actions. It's very important. Thanks.
Paula, many thanks. Very inspiring. So we're going to switch gears. So we've talked about technical barriers. We've talked about legal barriers. We're going to talk now about a third issue, which is personal security in public transport. Not too long ago, the International Labour Organization, ILO, released a report that said that basically women's limited access to mobility was reducing labor force participation by over 16 percentage points, which is huge. Sorry? 1.6. Over 16. My number says 16.5, but I always shave off the, for inaccuracy, the number behind the decimal point, but over 16% in developing countries. So that's quite a substantial, markdown. Amar, I know you've conducted very relevant research on women's mobility and personal security in Pakistan as part of your work at the Kennedy School. Can you share with us why personal security is such a barrier in Pakistan to women's mobility and how that impacts their access to employment opportunities?
Absolutely. If you conceptualize this issue, if you leave your home any given day, any one of us, there are a host of factors that determine our physical mobility in a city. I would start with an individual level factors. What's your income level? Do you have a car or you don't? There are some neighborhood or localized factors like, do you have good street lighting? Is it safe to be walking in the street? How far are you from the nearest transit stop? And then there are some broader society level factors like, what's the state of economic growth? Are there jobs available? There has to be a reason for you to leave the home. And of course, gender norms are overarching. And I think that in each of these respects, if you think closely, men and women have different experiences, and women, I think, bear the brunt of each of these factors. So at the individual level, statistics show, for instance, women are less likely to have driver's licenses or have own cars. And the neighborhood level, if street lighting is bad, women are less likely to venture out at night. And at society level, I don't think we need to say more than what has already been said about gender norms. So at all factors, it's incredible how women and men experience transport and mobility quite differently. And this is how I personally arrived at this topic and started working on this, because as I was doing a traditional economic impact evaluation of the Lahore Metro bus system, as ridership statistics started coming over and over again, I started to feel like men and women had very different experiences of mobility within the same city. For example, I saw that average fares for a woman were more than twice what a man would pay as an average fare. Women's trips are more complicated. They take more stops. Women are much more likely to travel with children. In Lahore, 16% versus just under 4%, are likely to have children. So if an escalator doesn't work, it affects you much more than it would if you're traveling alone. And then perhaps more importantly, from an economic standpoint, I saw that the modal distribution of trips was such that women were taking much more walking trips. So 44% of women's trips were walking versus 26% for men, which means in theory that you're able to access a smaller pool of jobs within a reasonable commute time. In an hour, there's only so much distance that you can cover walking. So with that in mind, we designed this SmartFall application, not one of the crowdsourced SmartFall applications, but actually a data collection instrument called Recap, in which we basically designed a 2 to 3 minute survey in which users could give us information in real time in a geographically specific way about their perception of safety in a public space. So how likely or fearful are you of being mugged or robbed? Are you being followed by someone? What do you observe around you? And what we did was, this is actually with support from the World Bank and others, we actually gave that app to a group of men and women in Lahore, and we had them use it for a couple of weeks, went all around the city on different public transport modes and in different parts of the city, and then we recorded how men and women perceive public spaces differently. And not surprisingly, we found that women are much more fearful in the same places at the same points in time. They are much more likely to be harassed or be fearful when they're waiting for a bus or when they're walking, not so much when they're on the vehicle. And so with that, what I conclude is that not only is this a personal security or a safety issue, but if we can't get enough women to come out of their homes and work, theoretically, this is an economic growth issue as well. And I think the more evidence we have on that, the better as we move forward.
Thanks, Amar. So you were able to document based on how people were using the app, the perception of insecurity, same place but different genders, right?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Very interesting. So let me turn to Alexa now about, again, problem, solution. But I know that we've talked a lot about new mobility. Of course, that's the theme of this year's Transforming Transportation. And one form of new mobility, of course, are ride-sharing applications. So can you tell us a little bit about how ride-sharing or ride-hailing apps change the dynamic around personal security, and where companies can best contribute to increasing women's sense of security and perception of security in mobility?
Yes, thank you. So it was important for us to understand how ride-hailing companies change the dynamic, because ride-hailing companies are already present in over 90% of countries worldwide, and that's really growing quite fast. So for that reason, IFC, together with Accenture, used data with Uber and surveys from over 11,000 drivers and riders in 6 countries to answer this question: how are drivers and riders, and particularly women, engaging with ride-hailing? It's a really kind of hefty report that we can share, but I think some of the most subtle and kind of interesting findings we had were specifically related to personal safety and security. And that's, so bear with me for a moment as I kind of try to walk through this, because what we found was a little bit divergent. First, on the one hand, when we asked participants in the survey, what would you most like to improve on the app? What would get you driving more? What would get you riding more, like just get you on the road? The biggest #1 answer across the 6 countries, and particularly for women, was improve safety and security features, like add new features, make the existing features better and more functional. And this was quite a dramatic response, to the degree that about 2/3 of women said that they thought the reason more women weren't driving more was because of safety and security issues or personal security issues. Even for the drivers that were on the road, said that they were changing their driving patterns and when they drove because of how they perceived security issues. Interestingly, men tended to wildly underestimate how much of an issue this was. So when we asked men, do you think women are changing their patterns? They said, oh, maybe a little bit, but actually no, it's the #1 issue for women engaging with ride-hailing apps. So it's definitely an area for improvement. That being said, at the same time, we asked, okay, what's the things that you like about the app already? Like, why are you choosing ride-hailing in comparison to other options? And the #1 answer was, again, the safety and security features as they currently stand. And that's because of things like location sharing, because if you can see your driver's photo in advance, et cetera. So it's definitely both ring very, very true. And I think coming back to your original question, what can companies do to deal with the many complicated issues that Amar outlined? I think this is something the private sector is very much asking itself, right? And that's because there's a very strong business case for them to do so. So across the 6 countries that we looked at, there was a range of about 35 to 70% of women using the app as customers, right, as a percent of the total ridership. So if you're in a country like Indonesia, where 75% of your ridership are women, you really want to know how they're using the app and what their challenges are, so you can better serve them. On the other hand, if you're in a country like Egypt or India, where there's only about 30% of ridership, there's a really strong market growth opportunity to finding these solutions. So that's what IFC is working with the ride-hailing sector to do. In terms of actual solutions, I think we've got a range of from both like very kind of easy short fixes to really some long-term thinking when it comes to systemic gender-based violence in transport. So in terms of easy solutions, I think quick fixes are things like communication. So a lot of responses we had were people saying, oh, we really want to be able to share our location without necessarily knowing that's something you can already do on the app in most locations. Some more like, they also wanted some new features like a in-app panic button to be able to communicate with the kind of local safety authorities. That's actually a fairly complicated ask because it means that you not actually have to have the button in the app, but also be able to share that with the authorities, have them be able to transfer that information appropriately and have them respond across multiple different companies. So I think some of the more long-term solutions might be some of the more subtle things that have really started to come up, and those are things like better tracking features. Back at HQ, looking at is there an unexpected stop? Is the driver going wildly out of where they're supposed to be, and being able to identify and prevent big issues before they take place. Over the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a really rapid acceleration of putting these solutions into practice. So I'm really hopeful for the future that we'll be able to continue to build on those.
So let me go back to Amr for another question. So when you hear all these ideas, some of them anecdotal, but quite powerful, about what could be done to increase a sense of well-being and self-security. So Isabel earlier was mentioning that they were developing an app that would let women know if an oncoming subway car is half full, empty, full, or whatever, and that women could make their choices about getting on based on that, right? And there's a lot of always discussion about improving lighting in public spaces, well-lit spaces, or give everybody a sense of security. I know Carla Dominguez, who used to be with the City of Mexico, they introduced an app, for example, so that women who were victims of sexual harassment on a bus could actually send a message to the driver, and the driver would press a button, and some public announcement would come on telling people to behave well. So, but what's your sense now? Being at Harvard, very rigorous, very, very analytical. Do we have a good evidence base on what works and what doesn't, or do you see that there's much more that we need to do?
I think that, as some of the discussion has touched upon, I think the issue in many of the countries that at least I've worked in is much more basic than rigorous evidence even. It's an issue of awareness. It's an issue of even accepting that this is a problem. I think that colleagues mentioned laws and legal legislation. My case is in Lahore in Pakistan, where the Punjab provincial government in 2012 passed what I think is a very nice law about women's safety in public spaces, very specific. Yet, there is a lack of awareness both among authorities and general public of the existence of this law. And then often, when we talk to policymakers and they try to convince us that well, we don't really have a harassment problem, often they cite complaint data, and we talked about data. A lot of the times, a very small percentage of the complaints that they receive in a given year relate to harassment, and I think that's part of the problem because, one, either users don't have faith in reporting that something's going to happen, or they're not aware of this reporting mechanism. But I think, coming back to your point about evidence, I think this is one case when I look at the literature where criminology, sociology, planning literatures are ahead of economics. And I think economics is now finally beginning to catch up. There's been, just in the last couple of years, some fantastic new studies that are beginning to shed light from an economics standpoint. I'll give a few examples. There is a new study that a colleague, a PhD student then at Brown, now at World Bank, did in New Delhi, where she found very compelling evidence that women are choosing lower-ranked colleges because they prefer to take what they perceive as safer routes. The study in Mexico, Carla and others that did, found that if you train bus drivers, make them more aware of the sensitivities, that they're much more likely to create better, safer public spaces. There's now ongoing work in Dar es Salaam where they're testing how different queuing behaviors or queuing, segregated versus not segregated queuing and seat reservations in different vehicles could have an impact on women's safety and so on. So I think the evidence base is beginning to catch up, But I should also point out that what works in one place doesn't necessarily work elsewhere. Of course, we have to start somewhere, but you have to think that some of these issues are very contextually specific. I mentioned localized factors, individual factors. So what works in Mexico may or may not work in Pakistan. But as second phase of our study, as I mentioned earlier, we are now beginning to, with the same app infrastructure we have, we're trying to make use of the natural variation in Lahore's public transport system, where in some cases the drivers are sitting behind this glass cage, they can't interact with passengers. In others, there are 2 reserved seats right next to the driver for women. And some places there are women-only buses. Some places there is a section reserved for women. Some places there's nothing. So what we're hoping to do is do a little bit more data collection to try to unpack some of these complications and try to distill some hard facts about what works and what doesn't work. So absolutely, there is a need to create more awareness, but also to do more rigorous studies and test what works.
So Amar said what works in Mexico City doesn't necessarily work in Lahore or in Pakistan more generally. Alexa, do you think something like ride sharing could work in Pakistan to increase women's sense of security? I mean, it obviously has the advantage of greater transparency. You know exactly who the driver is picking you up, you know where they're meeting you, you have their face, sometimes a picture or whatever, license plate of the car. So all that presumably contributes to a sense of security, that this is a managed trip. But do you think this is also a solution for women in developing countries and within developing countries for people on the lower end of the income spectrum? Or is it just a solution for rich women in developing countries?
I think that's a very fair question. And I think the Driving to Equality study does find that women are using ride-hailing to increase their mobility and security. So for instance, across the 6 countries, most of which were kind of emerging markets, women said their sense of independence increased by about 25%, but they were also able to travel more by about 20%. So there's already some substantial boosts happening for across the income spectrum. That being said, there's certainly ways that we need to think about making it kind of even more inclusive. And I think a lot of the things that are going to work the best to get more women onto ride-hailing aren't necessarily going to be framed as like gender initiatives per se. So for example, Amar mentioned that women take very complex trips. They have very complex travel patterns, and that very much was applied in ride-hailing. So women take more trips, they go to a greater variety of destinations, they're more likely to be traveling with groceries, with children, et cetera. That means they're very price sensitive. So women are more likely to prefer options like an Uber pool or any pooled option where the price has gone down a little bit. So I see expanding the pool option as being quite important to include more women. Even things like Uber and Careem both launched bus options in Cairo earlier this year, within the last couple of months. So I think that will drastically widen the pool of people who can access this form of transportation. Similarly, women were much more likely to use ride-hailing for elder care and family care. So options like being able to request a ride for someone who might not have it themselves would be really huge to help women not necessarily move themselves, but to reduce their time burden. And last but by no means least, we need to get more women drivers on the road. And that's in some ways simultaneously the most basic and the most complicated part of this picture. Women aren't represented well as drivers anywhere in the transport world. All the countries we looked at, they were well under 5% in terms of the total driver pool. But again, when we asked women, what do you want more of? What would get you driving more? They said universally more women drivers. And that was across the board, but particularly in high security, or what they saw as high risk opportunities like driving at night or when they're driving in a new city. Women wanted other women at the wheel. And actually getting more women on the road means addressing safety issues, but also kind of thinking outside the box in terms of how do we finance cars for women? How do we get women access to insurance? Because those emerged as really big barriers for women in ride-hailing that didn't necessarily pop up for men. However, if we can work that out, there's a very strong virtuous cycle between getting more women drivers on the road and getting more women riders on the road.
So thanks, Alexa. You've mentioned employment opportunities, women drivers, especially at night or in dangerous areas, that make other women passengers feel more safe. I know Minister Paula mentioned also that in her tenure in Chile, they actually provided grants for women to graduate from training courses, and they become a bigger part of the driving fleet in Santiago. So that takes us actually very naturally to our last set of issues around employment. And so we have Inka and Mayor Swad on that one. Let me just say that the World Bank has a gender cross-cutting solution area, and they're putting out a report about women in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And what they found, for example, in Latin America, as I understand it, is that in general, the gender gap in employment has narrowed in Latin America over the last decade or so, or several decades. However, it's been very stubborn in STEM. And so what we see is that women, even though they might be gaining ground in other areas, they might not be gaining them in science, technology, engineering, and math. I'm an engineer myself. I know when I graduated, I won't tell you when, but it was 17% of the graduates at my university were women, and I don't know what it's today, but it was incredibly low, a low percentage. So let me turn it to Inka and ask you, why does this low employment of women in STEM, why is that important? It's important socially, but why is it particularly important for transport and mobility? And can you tell us something more about the evidence that you see for those employment gaps?
Hi, thank you for having me. At the gender group, and I've recently left them to join ESMAP, which focuses on the energy sector, we believe that closing gender gaps in women's employment is smart economics. Occupational sex segregation is a large driver of these gaps, and it matters because incomes in different sectors vary. We know that women are overrepresented, for instance, in health and education, and men are overrepresented in sectors such as construction, engineering, and other technical roles. At the World Bank, the transport sector represents a large share of the World Bank commitments. It's about 43 billion at the moment, and that's about 20% of the work that we do. We were inspired by the fact that often our clients come to us, ministries of transport, rural roads authorities, and operators saying, we've identified a gap, but we don't really know how to close it. And you'll be surprised to know that we, Alicia Hammond and me, started this work because we realized that there wasn't much on the nexus between the public sector, STEM, in infrastructure, and women's employment. Most of the studies we have are from the private sector, and predominantly from developed country contexts. So when I mention some of the data and evidence, you'll see that a lot of this is coming from the US, the UK, and other countries. Turning to the data, a footnote, there is not much out there, but what we know, I'll walk you through briefly. Currently, we see more women entering engineering fields, but there are only 12% of engineers currently that are women. When women study STEM, they're less likely to go into STEM positions. So in many ways, that's a huge human capital loss, and you're not having them think about ideas and problems and creating systems that work for women. Global studies by the World Economic Forum indicate that the transport sector has about 35% of positions in high and middle income economies that are filled by women, and you're actually in the transport sector leading in terms of 12% of women in leadership positions and 9% of positions filled by women that are CEOs. That in no way means that we can rest and not address these issues. We also find in the airline industry that women are concentrated at about, for instance, in Ethiopia at 30%, in South Africa at about 50%, but then when you look at pilots and technical roles, that decreases to about 10 to 20%. And in the maritime sector, and we can have a debate about this, we're standing at about 2% of women's employment. A lot of travel, a lot of very heavy industry and male-dominated environments. So all of this plays into the picture on mobility. In the public sector, a Wilson Center study looked at what ministries are led by who, and the ones in infrastructure are about 18% led by female ministers, so that's a point that was already mentioned. And then the socio-cultural ministries, it's about 38%. So all of this in sum matters because by 2040, we're going to have $3.8 trillion of US dollars invested in the sector in mobility and transport. And we already know that about 6.6% of jobs in the emerging economy are filled by the transport and communication sector. So it really does matter.
Let me turn to Swad, the first female mayor of Tunis, as I mentioned before. You've been very patient. I guess we've been waiting 160 years for City Hall in Tunis, and you've had to wait till the last speaker on the panel. But let me ask you, how do you see the access to employment opportunities for women in Tunisia? And if you want to, both employment opportunities and educational opportunities, and if you want to make it more specific to mobility and the transport sector, that would be great. But perhaps you could just give us your sense of that.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I am so pleased to take part in this panel. I would like to thank the World Bank because this is such an honor for me to be part of this panel. At the outset, well, I can tell you that I am the first female mayor of Tunis after 160 years of male mayors. And it's no accident that I became the first female mayor. This was the result of a long process of advocacy work by both men and women. And these activists were really the ones that helped me become the first female mayor of Tunis. Because when you are a mayor, you are also a mother. It's this, the word sounds the same in French, mère and mère. It means you have to listen to everyone, to all of your citizens and all of your residents. So you need to be close to them and understand what their problems are. When I heard about this panel on mobility and women, I said, that seems like discrimination. We're here to talk about equality, not discrimination. We're here to talk about modernizing mobility. We're here to talk about equality. That should be the basis of any process of modernization. But when I delved a little bit further into this subject, I realized that there are many problems, which I'm hearing now on the panel too. Sometimes we feel these problems directly or indirectly. I was a member of Congress, the National Assembly, and I was very lucky to have that position. I was able to uphold rights and freedoms. I worked on laws involving equality and equity. Before I became mayor, I worked a lot on legislation. I worked on the regulatory framework. I worked on the legislative framework. There was a law on elections where we talked about horizontal and vertical parity. We also spoke about including young people. Actually, on our city council, one of our members is a woman, and she is only 24 years old. She's one of the youngest members on the city council, and she is the vice chair of the council now. So this is something that's important both for women and for youth. Going back to legislation and the issues of equity and parity, we voted on a law to stop violence against women. Again, I thought that that's what it meant to protect women. But because I am now a mayor and I'm so close to my citizens, I've really seen that there are many more problems, especially violence against women in public transportation. In Tunisia, currently, it's true that there are rights for women, but despite this, 48% of women have experienced some kind of harassment, especially in public transportation. It's a real problem, and we have to resolve this issue. We need to see how we can resolve this issue and find solutions while still upholding equality and making sure that there is no discrimination, because mobility should be a way for women to be included in society. We don't want women to be excluded, so we need to resolve this very important issue. Now, many women go to school. We are very modern. In 1955, we saw a great deal of progress with regard to rights to women, and later on, in 1956 and 1957, we passed laws to protect the rights of women. However, we still find that masculine attitudes are predominant. Now, I was elected mayor. I was the first woman to be elected mayor of an important capital city like Tunis. And really, that was a very strong political symbol, because Tunis is very important politically and in terms of legislation. However, a lot of the elites were against me being mayor. They said, how can a woman be a mayor of a capital city like Tunis? It was as if they thought it could only be for men. It didn't seem feasible to them in terms of law, in terms of religion, that a woman could hold a leadership position and lead a city as a mayor, and work on issues like fighting corruption, which is another issue that we're working on. However, we were able to show that the presence of women reduces the amount of corruption in many of our institutions. Women in Tunisia are highly educated. Education rates are very high. However, access to jobs is not the same for women as for men. In colleges, the majority of students are women, but that's not true for employees who are recruited. It's mainly men who get hired. And it's still an issue of this masculine mentality, as I said before. I can give you some data about mobility of women in Tunisia. Women need to have better mobility so that they can participate more fully in public life. That starts at school. And that's one of the major places that women travel to in Greater Tunis. They also travel for jobs, to see family, leisure, shopping, grocery shopping, among others. There was a study on the geography of transportation and the reasons why women take public transportation in Greater Tunis are in the following order: work, school, family, and leisure or recreation. We also see that girls need to have better opportunities to access jobs so that they can have greater freedoms. And this was something that we worked on back in the 50s. However, back in the day, many girls weren't able to go to school, and many were illiterate, a very high percentage. However, little by little, girls have been able to go to school. In 2014, the number of girls in higher education was about 45.41%. Whereas for boys, that's only about 36%. This shows that women in Tunisia, who are in this very particular Afro-Arab Muslim context, have rights that are protected: political, economic, and social rights. I should also point out that the improved level of education for women means that they are able to hold more jobs, about 28.2%.
Very much appreciated. Let me just take a show of hands, because I know we have just 10 minutes in the session. Who'd like to ask a question? I have some more, but I don't want to use up all the time. So we've got one here, one in the back. So I think, why don't we just use the rest of the time for questions, because we do have a number. Please go ahead. if you don't mind introducing yourself and then keep
Hi,
your question short.
my name is Gwen Cash. I'm a postdoc at Georgia Tech, and thank you all for the very thoughtful discussion. Many of you touched on the idea that data is extremely important for combating gender inequality. I think most of you also know that's only the first step, because after we complete our studies and we want to present them to planners or policymakers or engineers, we encounter many of these gendered norms that Lisette and several of the others brought up. I want to give an example that I wish were hypothetical. Let's say I am a transportation planner, and I might say, of course it's not a woman's fault if she's assaulted, but I might say, you know, on those crowded buses, I'm not sure that women know the difference between someone who's just rubbing up against them because it's crowded and someone who's assaulting them. That is a common view. If a researcher comes and presents me with 22% of women, 37% of women, 76% of women say this has happened to them, I might just go, well, yeah, they say that's happened to them, but that doesn't mean it's a real problem. So my question for all of you is, how do we cut through the attitudes that might make policymakers resistant to the good data that we know we need to collect?
Very good. So why don't we take two more, and if you could just keep your questions tightly worded and we can get more in, please.
Hi, this question is mainly for Inga. Based on your study on the presence of women in STEM, what would be the solutions or recommendations to increase the presence of women in the sector, in the transport agencies?
Congratulations for the panel, it's been excellent. Two quick questions. My company, Moving, is the largest motorcycle sharing platform, and we were very surprised to know that women are the majority of our users in some cities. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about it, if there's some vehicles that are more appropriate than others? And then my second question is that my non-scientific poll tells me that when I take an Uber, about 30% of the riders are women, of the drivers, sorry. But when I take a regular taxi, almost none are women. And I wonder if your thoughts about that, and what you think when cities banned Uber, if it has a gender impact. Thank you.
Okay. So who'd like to take the first question? So when you have good data, but you can't get politicians to listen to it, I don't know if Paula, you want to take that. You want to talk about how can you get, even if you have good data, how do you get decision makers to listen and not sort of dismiss it out of hand? I was going to say, anybody have any thoughts on that, or Isabel? Yeah.
I don't know if this is on. Yeah. Thank you, Gwen, for your question. And certainly, data, it's important, but I think there is enough data showing us that this is a serious problem. So right now, I would say we already built the business case on why do we need to work on gender. On how do you address this, I would say this is a multi-dimensional problem, multi-sector problem, and I think we're going more or less the right way. I don't know if at the right speed, but we need to come with very serious campaigns, sometimes very explicit things. We need to get some major involvement of private sector to tackle this issue. We need to work with the guilds of our sector. You were just mentioning one of them, which is the taxi drivers or the taxi guild, which is a pretty male-dominant sector traditionally. So I don't think there is a unique formula. I would say that right now, with the numbers, with a different narrative, we have a little bit more of attention of from different public officials. And as an example, I already see like some cross-fertilization on what one city is doing, and let me provide an example. The campaign on Bájale el acoso or Stop Harassment in the case of Quito is already being, adapted and escalated in cities like Buenos Aires and potentially in Bogota. So still, we need to move at a faster speed. Numbers are terrible. And probably this is just anecdotal, but recently, or probably this week, I don't know if you've seen the ad of Gillette. Now you see the industry talking about these issues. Like, we cannot think, this bad behavior, especially in public spaces, is a normal thing. This is a call for action, and just as probably road safety became something so popular and it was declared the decade of action, I think we're like in the right time to do the same for inclusiveness and equality, more than a discourse on women. One thing that I want to point out, I'm sure the majority of us, when we think about gender, we say, oh, it's women. Well, it's not. And that's part of the conversation that we start to have to address.
Excellent. Inka, I think the second question was for you. Yeah.
Yep. Is this on? Okay, great. Favorite topic. We don't have enough time to cover it all, but address the pipeline. STEM gaps are across primary, secondary, and tertiary level. We can't address this just at the employment level. Expose girls to STEM. We know that from our research, they're more interested if you frame this career pathway and mobility around a social good, so creating a better society. Tap women's networks. A lot of our research shows that both women and men can be biased in terms of referring candidates. You have great networks such as the Women in Transport International. Demonstrate clear commitment to gender equality in your leadership meetings, in your advertising externally. South African Airways has been doing this very strongly over the past years with female technicians. Childcare, the IFC is doing great work around this. Women have the burden of care on them in terms of elderly care and childcare. So look at those policies and make the changes. This is, of course, costly. GBV policies, affirmative action, this is, of course, very debated, but data does show that earmarking positions on women in boards is creating progressive change in Europe and countries where they have put that in place, and consider gender certifications so that you can actually get a baseline and track your progress towards closing those gaps.
Thank you. Does anybody want to take the question about shared ride pooling? Yeah, please, Alexa.
I think I should. Yes, one of my favorite questions. So I think there are two angles to what you're talking about, both the women as drivers and kind of women as riders. On the driver side, actually, one of the big questions we had going into this study was, is the ride-hailing and the sharing economy more broadly going to contribute to reducing labor force segregation between men and women? And very academically, the answer that we came up with was sort of, right? And yes, in the sense that ride-hailing is definitely helping women get into a sector that can be very hard to get into, because if it's dominated in a way that's monopolistic or just very strong male social networks, it's a lot easier to sign up for an app than to get a taxi certification, for instance. Similarly, the flexibility of the hours is a really big factor in getting women onto these apps. Women wanted to work in a flexible way much more than men, so they were much more likely to say, actually, I want to be just working 10 hours a week. I just want to work in the evenings. So in that sense, there's a really good needs matching on the platforms as well. Last but not least, women's incomes jumped at a greater rate than men's did once they started driving for the apps. Partly because women were, strategic drivers, in part because women started from a very low income point to begin with. So there's definitely some potential there. That being said, outside of the U.S. and parts of Europe, in the markets where the World Bank Group tends to work, we're still talking about a couple percentage of women as drivers in total. So a long way to go for both kind of taxis and ride-hailing companies. You also asked why do we have more women using our app for motorcycles? I think going back to this affordability point, women are taking more trips. They want affordable options. They want to try different forms of transport for different needs. So I think that fits in with the data quite well. Interestingly, though, when it comes to the affordability is kind of king or queen for women riders, motorcycles in emerging markets seem to be a little bit the exception, and that's more when you're getting on a motorcycle with someone else, and that's obviously because the physical proximity is a little bit in your face when you're getting on a motorcycle and literally touching someone else. So I think that one might be a little bit of a hard hill to climb.
So we're actually at 3 o'clock, but I see 3 people with questions. I know they're extremely short questions. So why don't we give them a chance? They've been waiting patiently in line. Very short, 3 questions.
Hi, Jenny Wells with New York City Transit. I was formerly with the research team here at WMATA, DC Metro, and we found that late night trips for women were only 41% of all trips, whereas during the peak periods and midday, they were 53%, which is more or less in line with the DC population. So clearly women don't feel safe taking public transportation at night, even in a city like DC, where we think the issues may not be as grave as in other areas. So keeping in mind what Amar said in terms of certainly a solution in DC wouldn't be the same solution in Lahore, Nairobi, Maputo, et cetera. But what are some things that we could do that don't involve just pushing women onto ride-hailing apps, which is neither sustainable, but even more problematically not equitable, and also would be putting the burden, the financial burden of paying more for a trip back onto women? So thinking about solutions in public transport where we can make women feel safer, I'd like to hear from the panel.
Great question. Thanks for that. Second one.
Hi, my name is Jeremy. I'm a student at UC Berkeley. And I know in travel demand modeling and travel behavior research in general, we've been starting to look more closely at gender. And I'm wondering from you guys, what are your most burning questions related to travel and gender that we, the research community, can be looking at further?
And last but not least.
Hi, my name is Mariana Gomes. I'm from Fortaleza, Brazil. And we are writing just now the documents for our share bike, the bidding documents for our share bike system. And we would like to add a clause demanding that at least 20% maybe of the people that are working in the maintenance of the bikes and the operational parts would be women. And we just hit with the regulation people. They are saying that that's not a constitutional demand, and if we're going to ask for representativity for women, we should do that with the LGBT community or African descendants. And I would like to ask what your thoughts about that, and if you have any other recommendations in regards to that, like bringing more representativity of women through contracts. Thank you.
Thank you. So I see the three questioners have become four. I'll take the fourth, but this is really the end, so please.
Thank you. It's for Alexa, and it's super short. In the research study that you did the safety and security issue come up at all where the ride-hailing groups did not actually have signage on the front of their vehicles, like the Uber or the Lyft, for example? I've been in situations where, yeah, I have it all on the app, but they don't have their required signage, and for me, that's a safety issue, and I'm just wondering if that's anything that came up. Thank you.
Okay, very good. So who wants to take the question about how to keep women on public transport late at night? That was the first one.
If I can take that question more broadly, I think what I took away from that question was, why should the burden of trying to do something about it be on women? It's not sustainable, it's not equitable. And here I would say I was talking to the head of UN Women in Pakistan, and he came up with this very interesting idea. He said, if we can fine people for parking in the wrong spot, why can't we start issuing fines and tickets to men as and when they misbehave, or whoever conducts something like that? So I think I take your point that the burden it's a public good issue, and the benefits could be more widely accessible. So maybe that's one way of doing it. It's improved enforcement and fine and ticketing.
So maybe the second question I'll pass to Jose. I mean, basically Berkeley asking for ideas for further research. Some other researchers with ideas for that.
So in the work we've been doing with Marina Moscoso between the WRI and Despacio, we found many interesting things, but one of the issues we found was, for example, women tend to be more self-contained in their areas. So maybe finding out if this lack of accessibility is 100% transport-related issue, or is also culturally, and how can we deal with this issue with transport? Maybe that's one of the issues I don't think we still know, and probably issues related with women cycling who are not using it as much as men in a case like Bogota, and I'm sure almost all over the world, and trying to find out the most efficient way to improve this.
I know since we're really tight on time now, there was the third question from Mariana from the Transportation Secretariat of the city of Fortaleza. what can you do about those clauses? You know, requesting that 20% of women maintaining bicycles, I think it was, the employment be from women and not give the same rights to other disadvantaged groups. Anybody have any ideas on how to handle that or how to respond to those? Paula, do you want to take a stab at that, or?
Yes, I think it's necessary put the obligation for the number of the women in this contract, maybe in the law. For example, for the political woman, it's necessary the law of obligation for them. In Santiago, the new contract establishes the about 5%, but along the time it's necessary increase this number. But the begin, maybe 5%, it's good.
5%, very good. And the last question Rachel asked about ride-hailing and additional signage and letting information about security. Does anybody want, I know we have our ride-hailing specialists. Do you want to take that?
Excuse me. So I'm interpreting that as a sign as in like a Lyft-Uber sign somewhere on the car. I think it's ride-hailing is hyper-localized. So in the contexts where ride-hailing has not been universally welcomed and there's actually kind of violent protests by the taxi industry, it makes a lot of sense not to have a sign on the front of your car. I think in some place like DC, it makes companies are rolling out options like trying to better color match. You can actually find your right driver and confirm and making sure that you're actually kind of getting into the right car. I think riders themselves have to do a little bit of work and actually they're given a lot of information about the right car, the right driver, and actually checking that before you get in. I know a lot of people who have got into the wrong Uber, but a lot of solutions they're happy to take offline.
Very good. I know we're a little bit over time, but I think it's a reflection of the passion both in the room and on this panel here. Let me just invite you to give a big round of applause for our panelists today. I have to say I was very impressed that after last year's discussion on just identifying that transport isn't gender neutral, a year later having a discussion that's much more granular on specific problems and actually some very good solutions to that. So thank you for your technical knowledge, but also for your commitment to this agenda. I also want to acknowledge two other people, the two Carlas, Carla Gonzalez and Carla Dominguez, who helped organize this session. Very good. So we have coffee outside, and at 3:15 we'll have our last plenary, the closing plenary. Thank you.